I think, oops, okay. So we would like to start now, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome Emilia Sanabria here, and I will just quickly introduce her to you and then hand over to her for her talk. So Emilia holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge and was a lecturer at ENS Lyon from 2011 to 2018, before joining the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris for 2018. And since last year, you're a member there, right? Yeah. So, okay. Her research focuses on the anthropology of the body, on pharmaceutical practices, of which we will hear more today, of drugs and addiction, nutrition and practices of knowledge, and also of ignorance in public health. Her book, Plastic Bodies, Sex, Hormones, and Menstrual Suppression in Brazil, from 2016, provides an ethnography of hormonal contraceptives in Brazil and offers an analysis of pharmaceuticals as objects of knowledge and circulation. And currently, Emilia is the principal investigator of a research project called Healing Encounters. And this project studies the striking expansion and prolific reinventions of healing practices that make use of the hallucinogenic Amazonian herbal brew Ayahuasca, which will also be a major focus in her talk today. So thank you for being here, and have a good talk.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've been involved in questions and thinking through bodies in trouble through all these different objects that you presented around nutrition, drugs, hormones, the menstruating body, but mainly from the fields of anthropology and science and technology studies. So it's been a real pleasure to be here in this conversation. This is very generative, and so I'm very grateful for the invitation. And I ask you to bear with me because I'll be speaking from a very different perspective as an anthropologist. I also just wanted to say this talk is about communication and translation, and I very much appreciate the possibility of being able to speak in English. So please do slow me down if I speed up too much. So I'd like to start by plunging right in with a song, a very important song that is sung by a man called Iban Doué-Baké Huniquin, who is an indigenous scholar, an artist, and a dear friend. So if we can have the song to start with. This is Iban.
Chai kama guru. Chai pu pu, chai pu pu, chai pu pu是大pu pu是大巴克尼，pu pu是大巴克尼，巴克尼布伊基姆，巴克尼布伊基姆。啊咦咦咦咦咦咦咦咦啊咦咦咦咦呀。泣いたる泣いたる泣いたるなわたるあなぶいむたるあなぶいむたるあなぶいむたるあなぶいむあいいい
Ayahuasca ritual. Amongst the Huniquin, ayahuasca is known as nishipe. So when I refer to nishipe, I mean ayahuasca, which is the Quechua term for this brew that is diffused all around the northwestern Amazonian zone. So Iban received this corpus of chants from his father Chanatuin, who received them from his father and from his grandfather, and so on for generations immemorial. And what Iban tells us is that this song is actually a song that comes from to his ancestor from what he calls the spirit of the forest, or espírito da floresta, which is already a translation from his language into Portuguese. And this spirit of the forest is sometimes personified as a mythical ancestor known as Yube Inu, who was enchanted by an anaconda woman, a spirit who could transform from snake to woman. And her father taught this ancestral figure, Yube Inu, how to make the ayahuasca brew. So this is a painting by Ibn of this mythical couple from which ayahuasca comes for his people. So Yube Inu's story is a long and gloriously convoluted one, which I will not go into here, but suffice it to say that it ended rather badly for him. His bones were crushed and he was killed by his serpentine lover after he left her and the children he had begotten with her to return to his human kin. So this is a very classical trope in Amazonian kinship and mythology, this transition from animal to human worlds. From his body sprouted the 9 varieties of Banisteriopsis capi, which is one of the 2 plants that go into this brew that the Huniquin keep. And here's another painting that shows this sort of human origin to the plant. And from his heart sprouted the Psychotria viridis shrub, which is the other plant that goes into the Nishipe brew. So we have an origin story of ayahuasca in which a human who encounters a serpent woman becomes the origin of a plant. So Ibn founded the Maku, the movement of Huniquin indigenous artists, with whom he has been visually transcribing the chants that accompany the Nishipe rituals. This project has been a huge success. It's drawn a lot of attention. There's been documentaries, such as the one I just showed off YouTube, exhibitions. Maku exhibited at the Fondation Cartier a couple of years ago. And Ibn's motivations for founding this multimodal medium is very interesting. It has to do with what he refers to very explicitly as the limits of translation. When he recorded and transcribed the chants that his father was the keeper of, he carried out what he himself calls a first translation, which is a translation between a neural human language, Hachaquin, which is the Huniquin language, it means the language of the real people, into its written form. And written Hachaquin is, of course, a neocolonial artifact. It's the product, it's a codification in writing that is the product of bilingual education programs that emerged with the Brazilian state's sort of incursion into indigenous territory. And he was training as a bilingual educator when he did this first transcription of the chants. And to give you an idea of how complicated this first translation already is, this is what Hachaquin in sort of our script looks like in writing. So this first transcription or translation into the written form was met with numerous requests to further translate from this version into Portuguese. People wanted to know what the songs were about, right? So jokingly, Ibn recounts that he responded, now that would be completely impossible. That would be going far too far into the realms of incommensurability. There would be a loss there. So I want to use this deceptively simple problem of translation to open up a discussion here about communication between humans and non-humans, and ayahuasca as a form of communication technology. For what Ibn tells us is that this language is the language of the sacred ayahuasca chants, are, in his words, the oldest speech. He and the Maku collective that he founded are attempting to reveal the gaps and the displacements that are required to move from Hachaquin to the colonial language of Portuguese. And there's a real impossibility here, he says, because Portuguese, like French or German or English or Spanish or colonial languages, cannot render the worlds of the forest in the way that his language, Hachaquin, can. And he explains this by reference to the fact that it is, in fact, the very spirit of the forest that provided these chants to humans, to the Hachaquin human beings that received these songs. And here he says that Nishipe its agency is actually one of translation, a trans-species kind of translation or communication. And the message that Nishipe conveys is that, and I quote from him again, he's published work on this that I'm citing, everything is alive, everything is looking, everything is listening. And thus he concludes, so these songs come from the drink. And if you remember, the drink comes from this human body, from Nishipe, which has come for a long time. The drink is very, very old. It is the oldest speech, the speech of Nishipe. So that's what we sing. So to overcome the impossibility of translating the songs of Nishipe in the vein that anthropologists often attempt it, Iban and his collaborators have been developing visual and multimodal renditions or translations of these songs. The objective for him is to move from a cognitive or a semantic approach to a more phenomenological, embodied, extrasensory, and multimodal one. Otherwise said, the objective is to move beyond meaning, which is what classical scholarly focus seeks to reveal, and instead to translate sensorially. So in the video that I opened with, which was produced by the Maku Collective, the multimodal approach is already trying to demonstrate or to reveal this transformability between the human form and the animal form, where the anaconda is, of course, a key figure. So while we here in the West are currently witnessing a massive boom of interest in plant communication and sentience, and here are but two examples of this, this language that Iban is referring to is not stricto sensu a plant language. It is what he calls the spirit of the forest speech. And this speech is uttered or conveyed by many different beings in interaction. What is speaking, so to speak, is a kind of webbed ecological sentience in which the principles of relationality and transformation are absolutely central. Right? So we have kind of more than plant, more than human, and more than animal forms that are in this process of transformability amongst and between each other. So beings that are spirits can transform into beings that are embodied, and one kind of body can become another. And all this is determined and guided by an ethic of relating, of right relation, that safeguards these transformations or renders them very perilous. And a lot of mythology is about sort of providing a kind of framework, or Iban refers to it as an ethical principle of how we are to engage. There's a lot of stories about, for example, not accepting food from spirits that one might encounter in the forest, or this is all very codified. So the songs themselves are key to this work of transformation, particularly during the ayahuasca ritual. They are complex bitonal performances. As we heard, they have a very particular kind of sound. And few are those who currently still really know how to sing this corpus. It's a huge corpus. It's a lot to memorize, and it's a lot to be able to embody. And yet these songs are absolutely critical. The elder generations of healers amongst the Huni Queen will say, because they provide a kind of lifeline, right, to those who are journeying with the ayahuasca into the realms of, other worlds. Anthropologist Else Lagrue tells us that the songs have a complex enunciator. That means that within their very grammatical structure, the subject is both the person who is singing, the person of whom the song is about, so often Yube or Yubeinu, which is this anaconda transformation kind of figure, and the one who is singing, and the one to whom it is sung. So there's this kind of grammatical formation which renders it very difficult to say, there's no subject, object, and sort of content. It's all about the transformation between these perspectives. And that's embedded in the very sort of grammar of the song. So in this sense, the singing of the songs is a means of opening up this potential space of transformation as it was transmitted, across this trans-species border and kept by the chanas. Chanas are the keepers of the song, who in turn guide those into their own transformative realms during the rituals. So a lot of the key word amongst the Hunikuinen and amongst the Pano-speaking world, who are very well known in that region for their ayahuasca knowledge and technology, is the word kene, which means design. And design is this sort of space that one is said to enter, and one has to find an orientation within the space of design. So weaving and beadwork are technologies that help to sort of ground these lifelines into these other realms. So it's absolutely crucial to remember that this transmission that I've just described actually took place within a context of violent colonization. For the Hunikuin, this took the form of the rubber estate and what is widely referred to locally still today as the domestication of wild Indians. That's the language that people use. So this is the rubber period, which only really ended in the 1980s. Much of the people who are now perceived as traditional healers were rubber tappers for many, many years and conducted this practice very much underground. So there's this very intense story that is often written out of anthropological approaches and accounts of Amazonian shamanism. So the Hunikuin are a Pano-speaking indigenous group who live on both sides of the Peruvian-Brazilian border. And the villages that have formed along the Jardin, which is the river system on which I'm working, were established by rubber baron Felizardo Cerqueira. And you can see here a man's arm that has been tattooed with a very important plant called genipapo, with the initials of this rubber baron. Now, Cerqueira is widely described here as having been a benevolent baron, if rape can be considered benevolent. He offered safety to those that he settled on his estate, in comparison to the many kin of the Hunikuin who were well into the 1970s still being massacred. So the safety that he offered on this estate was at the price of being allowed to speak one's language. Hachaquin was forbidden, to wear one's adornments, to paint oneself, and to practice one's rituals. So it's a very ambivalent story. People have all sorts of tales. Felizardo Cerqueira died in the 1930s, so there's very much a living memory still of this man's presence. As Iban recalls, my father worked in the seringa. Seringa is the term for rubber plantation. It was very hard. The seringalista, the boss, did not allow any rituals. His father placed it all away very deeply. My father was never sad, never forgot the thing that he guarded inside his heart, the secret that was his music. It was prohibited to speak the language, but he guarded it inside him. The Nawa, so this is us, the non-indigenous people, wanted to do away with our knowledge, with our soul. Yaka, who is his daughter, here in the middle, is one of Iban's daughters. She's 22 years old, and she's a leading figure of the Kayachibu collective that she founded, and that is promoting Hunikuin culture among urban-dwelling indigenous youth, where racism and discrimination is extremely strong. She's very active on Instagram and on Facebook, and has a very astute perspective on the political situation that is currently rocking Brazil. She tells me that the Hunikuin on the other river system, so they're a group that is scattered on quite a large territory. There's now 11,000 people, so there's very different realities that these different groups are facing. So on the other river systems, they're facing serious problems with alcoholism and evangelicism of the kind that actively depreciates and also prohibits native culture. So here in the Jardin, she tells me, there is no alcohol, thanks to the revitalization of Nishipe rituals, which are playing a very important role. And she tells me, we know who we are here. We know where we come from. We were able to rise up. You will not see any alcohol in our communities. And that's true, and it's a very striking thing and an important thing. So historically, it seems that ayahuasca actually played a very critical role in political conscious raising, leading in the late 1980s to a very important moment of indigenous land demarcation. It was a very insufficient movement, but there was a lot of land that was demarcated. And speaking to indigenous organizers who were involved in this process, it seems that ayahuasca was quite an important mechanism of social transformation at this period. So one person, Chay Macedo, who was an ally of Chico Mendes, explained in an interview, "When I served ayahuasca to a group, I would bring elders who had kept their relation to ayahuasca, and I would sit them in front of the others. And they brought it all back. Today, they are reclaiming the struggle for indigenous territory, and they obtained this consciousness all from the first glass of ayahuasca that we served. I would say, Chay is the ally, friend, I'm going to serve this glass of ayahuasca to you, to your father, to your brothers. First, for you to stop drinking cachaça, alcohol, and for you to drink your own people's drink. The other is for you to dive into the spirit of your culture, who you are and your people." So we can see the resonance of this kind of language in Yaka and the younger generation's kind of speech. So for the Huni Queen, as for many indigenous peoples, plants are sentient beings. They have a spirit. They are alive. There is no ambiguity about that for them. They have intention, will, agency. They have kin patterns. And some plants, such as the Banisteriopsis capi vine that makes up Nishipe, have a particularly strong spirit and are recognized as teachers. So these are the two plants that come into the ayahuasca brew. But indigenous understandings of the life worlds of plants do not distinguish between species. This is a very Western representation, right, of how this works. In this sense, one cannot speak of plants from an indigenous perspective without speaking of the whole landscape, the living landscape, and the other beings with which they exist, and without whom they cannot thrive. Plants like those that make up the ayahuasca brew reminds us that these beings exist in and through encounters, multiple layered encounters. So just to backtrack a little bit and to sort of give you a bit of the context in which I'm carrying out this research, it's a 5-year ethnographic project that involves 5 people, and we're investigating the circulations and reinventions of ayahuasca in 3 interrelated sites, which are the forest, the city, and the lab. I mean, this is formal grant talk, right? In these 3 sites, ayahuasca is used according to quite different understandings of the body, of healing, and of what or who plants are and what they can do. These sites nevertheless converge around a common idea that ayahuasca brings about something called healing, in Portuguese, curar, and that this healing involves some form of communication with a plant or the plant's spirits. And so we're looking at the sort of disjunctions and understandings of the body and healing and spirit that are operating through these different sites. Now, I've dealt at length here with the forest site, but I'll just give you a little bit of context about the city and the lab before closing with some reflections on what it means to think of plants as speaking. So these are the 3 sites. And if we go to the city, so contemporary urban ritual uses of ayahuasca have a very complex and fascinating genesis. They're characterized by a huge multiplicity of different ritual practices and a lot of recombining of different traditions, including Amazonian, Afro-Brazilian, Spiritist, transpersonal, Christian, and many, many more that just keep getting added on. So one version of the origin story spoken from Brazil starts with Raimundo Irineu, who is a northeastern man, presented here in this painting in the middle, who came, he was an Afro-Brazilian rubber tapper who arrived in Acre, in the state of Amazonia, in 1912 to tap rubber. And he discovers ayahuasca with indigenous people. There's a lot of different stories and versions of this story, whether it was the Ashaninka people or the Huni Queen people. There's a debate. But he makes a mythical encounter with a female being in the forest that he's going to interpret as the Virgin Mary, who tells him to found a cult, a religion. And so from Mestre Irineu, 3 syncretic religions, state-recognized religions, are born: the Santo Daime Church, the União do Vegetal, which comes later, and Barquinha. Now today, most ayahuasca groups practicing in Europe or in the US do so on the basis of a religious exemption which was obtained by the UDV or the Santo Daime. And indigenous peoples in Brazil are not allowed to travel with their medicine. To do so, they have to found a church. So there's this very intense, complex context here. And many indigenous people are actually founding churches to be able to practice their medicine. So as part of the project, I work with so-called neo-ayahuasquero groups led by people who were initiated in these religions, but who have developed their work mainly around therapeutic practices in new directions, breaking with this sort of first quadro, this first context. Many of these new ayahuasquero groups come back to what they call the source, often in these very romanticized and idealized representations of indigenous people, forging new links and bridges between urban white people in the megapoles of Brazil and the forest. So in these urban sites, like in the forest, it's common to hear people refer to plants as speaking or as communicating, but this unfolds in a radically different sort of context than the Amazonian understandings. So moving swiftly on to the lab, what we're doing here is to sort of situate ayahuasca's globalization within, looking at its place within the so-called psychedelic renaissance. So as some of you may be aware, psychedelic compounds and plant medicine such as LSD or psilocybin or MDMA, iboga as well, are currently being re-examined for their potential as therapeutic agents in mental health for problems such as depression, anxiety, addiction, or PTSD for trauma. So there's a swathe of articles and editorials in a lot of publications have come out in PubMed. And there's a lot of hype around this. So we're looking at that. What is interesting about the clinical trials, this is a classical setup of the clinical trials exploring the efficacy of these psychedelic compounds in a clinical context, is that they recognize and experimentally try to assess the importance of the ritual context in which the medicine is being deployed. This is referred to in the native idiom as set and setting. So the emphasis is very much on the synergetic effect, like the drug and the setting, the context. And what they're assessing is neither the drug nor the therapy, but what happens when you bring the two of those together. And the claim is something very different. So ayahuasca, being the medicine here which perhaps has least been severed from its various ritual contexts, plays a very interesting role within this broader movement and is informing a lot of thinking across this border. So as it's taken up in an ever-growing range of new ritual or experimental practices, a lot of questions are emerging around authority, authenticity, safety, propriety, and questions around how this contingent yet fragile efficacy of ayahuasca is being enfolded into legal and scientific forms. How is the other of science made recognizable within its frame, and what is at stake for both science and for ayahuasca in this process? To put it very bluntly, as I'm often told, drinking ayahuasca is opening to the sentience of another living being. People tell me in all three of these sites repeatedly that ayahuasca, unlike the synthetic compounds LSD or DMT, which is one of the active molecules in ayahuasca is alive. That's something that I hear a lot, and that's sort of drawing my attention. So people say that, drinking ayahuasca is about engaging a relation with another being. At stake, then, is the creation of resilient institutional practices that can sustain this translation through its apparently inevitable globalization without killing it. So just briefly to conclude and to open up the discussion around the themes that we've been gathered here around, the introductory text for the conference that we're here for proposes that new technological developments are profoundly transforming the freedom to make the body and our environment. Now, what anthropology teaches us, if anything, is that the idea that nature comes unshaped, given, raw, not cooked, and that modern man with a capital M is the great transformer is a huge fallacy. All human collectives have shaped their bodies and their environments as profoundly as they have given form to their social structures. This is not new. So we need to think differently about what is new that's happening here. I do agree that something is transforming, but we cannot rely on that contrast to articulate that novelty. As I've argued at length elsewhere in relation to questions of gender and sexuality in my book, Plastic Bodies, this distinction between nature and culture is really not the right place to ground our political response. That just opens up the avenue for neo-fascist and patriarchal positions. So we have to be very careful about that. We cannot be nostalgic for a version of nature as the ground upon which culture erects itself, as that which came before culture and ceases to be natural under the influence of this encounter. Instead, we need to constantly reimagine an ethic of being transformed in and with the non-human ecosystemic worlds that we depend on. Indigenous peoples' alternative ways of being must not, I believe, become the placeholders for some mythic past before we, excuse my language, fucked up. Their plant knowledge, their art, their culture is deeply technological. It is deeply contemporary. It is not the past. It is very much the present. And you can see here just some representations of this technological engagement. There's tool making, there's transformation, all the themes that we've been discussing here about sort of, cyborgs and human, animal, and plant mixtures could very much apply to how we think about, what indigenous people have been doing for a very long time in their engagements with the world. So their way of being involves a radical reworking of the given, of what we in the West would call the natural world. There is no nature that they exist in. Their quote-unquote natural world is deeply social. They build and sustain cosmopolitical alliances with all the beings that are around them in the forest, and including the white beings that have come to demolish their forest. So their relations are guided, however, by a very different set of ethical principles than the ones that we have allowed to dominate here in the West. So I'd like to close with some reflections from Monica Gagliano, who does a very beautiful job at rendering such an alternative ethic of being with plants. She makes that intelligible in very interesting ways, and she's been doing incredible work making that publishable in hegemonic scientific institutions. In her book, Thus Spoke the Plants, Gagliano reflects on what it means to give voice to plants without speaking for them. And this is a very tricky question, of course. She reminds us that to communicate requires a space of dialogue and reciprocity. If we begin from the assumption that the other, the plant, does not and cannot speak or communicate, we are not in the best position to hear what they have to say. To begin the dialogue, therefore, requires transcending our human narcissism and anthropocentric propensities towards exceptionalism. In her words, and I quote, "When we learn to listen to plants without the need to hear them speak, a language that we have forgotten emerges. It is a language beyond words that conveys its rich and meaningful expression by bypassing the household of the mind." End of quote. Now, one of the most important books that I've come across as I try to grapple with these questions is this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, by Native American botanist Robin Cole Kimmerer. And in this book, she weaves together botanical and indigenous stories of plant-human relations in a really evocative and deeply personal way. Reflecting on botany, which she is careful to distinguish from the language of plants, she notes that botanical knowledge is precise, but, and I quote, based on a profound error in grammar, an omission, a grave loss in translation from the native languages of these shores. And she's writing from North America as a North American native woman. This error robs non-human persons, such as plants, of their selfhood. The arrogance of colonial languages such as English is that the only way to be worthy of moral concern or selfhood is to be human. And she concludes this magnificent book with a reminder that learning from other species requires humility. Returning throughout the book to Native American stories and myth, she recalls how, throughout the Americas, humans were commonly viewed as the newer, less mature beings in the democracy of species, the younger siblings of creation, those who still had to be taught by the other species. Plants are often presented as the elders in these stories, having been on Earth the longest. They had time to figure things out, she says. They live above and below the ground, holding the earth together. They turn light into sugar and exemplify the virtue of generosity, offering bountiful food and medicine. So she asks, what if Western scientists saw plants as teachers rather than subjects? What if we told our stories from that lens? And I'll close with that. Thank you.
So I will just hand this to you. Are there any questions yet? Don't be shy.
As you are more or less started.
Sorry, we need the microphone.
I guess you have been. Thank you. Yes, you are started. This is process. This is ritual of ayahuasca. So, just a question: did you try it too?
Have I tried ayahuasca? I have, yes.
And
It's so interesting. I've done many different research projects on all sorts of different drugs, on food, on hormones, and I never got that question when I was doing my other projects. And this is the first and inevitable question that comes up again and again. So I think the answer is, and I started a research project on it because it raises so many difficult and complex questions that there is no answer I could possibly provide in answer to and. And it's complicated. And there's a whole lifetime ahead to answer that question. I don't want to be flippant about it, but there's many different discourses that are circulating, many different politics that surround that, and it requires a lot of delicacy to engage with that respectfully and meaningfully. So I think for me, the way I understand ayahuasca is very much as a way to ask questions. I'm concerned about the way that it has become a goal or an endpoint or a sort of, this magic bullet. And I don't think that is serving anything very productive in this moment. So my intention is very much to push past that and use the questions it raises to ask, bigger questions about, where we are at in this moment in history. I find it interesting that ayahuasca is expanding in this particular way at this particular moment, because I do think we're in a very peculiar historical conjuncture right now.
yeah, this is true because it was not some kind of question that suddenly happened, because in Brussels we do have a lot of practice of ayahuasca, and it's coming it's in Paris too, and there is sort of the union of shaman. I never participated, but I know people who went there, went through the ritual, and it's also something that some people really find very good. Let's say very good influence and just help in different cases of depression. And because of this, also for me, it was interesting to know also this is medical aspect of it, because it seems that it's possible to use it in really real medicine now.
So what is real medicine?
Real medicine, so it means that to be recognized, like to be healing process, because real, it's I mean it in sense of that recognizable by the state and permitted to do. And in other practices, because like for example homeopathy and another, they're quite refused now more and more by the state.
Yeah, I think this is particularly what's interesting about this situation, is that there is a tremendous utopia around psychedelics in general. Ayahuasca is part of this broader movement. And from the perspective of hegemonic mental health, this is extraordinary. From the perspective of indigenous realities, this is horrifying. So how do we keep those two stories together? How do we not just fall into making this another appropriation? And I think that's really what's at stake for me.
Over there was a question, right? Or did you? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. There. And then after that, it's you. So also, if you want to ask a question, just signal me. I try to keep a list of you. Okay.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to channel all the questions I have. I've been traveling in Latin America quite a lot. I got offered ayahuasca in Colombia. I refused because of one particular thing that is distracting me, is the vomiting part, the puking, which so far we didn't talk about. And I was wondering, what is it like for you to, because as of my knowledge, it's basically a chemical reaction. The plant is so acidic that you do throw up, but it's also a big part of the healing. It's helping you to clean your body, your soul, and there's a sort of preparation to it. So I want to understand how does it feel for you, and how is the concept behind the throwing up of cleaning, because it's a physical cleaning, it's not only a psychological one.
Yes, it's an important aspect of ayahuasca that keeps many people away. Perhaps that's a good thing. I think that this aspect really relates to the very different ontologies of the body that are circulating. So in indigenous Latin America, the body is perceived in a completely different way, and purgatives are used. There is a culture of using purgatives that stems well beyond ayahuasca. So from that perspective, it's a very normal thing to remove, they wouldn't call it excess or toxicity, but to clear the body and make it ready for different spiritual practices. So I think it's important to put that in its place. I'm aware that there are people who are doing biomedical analyses of this from different angles, from the microbiome angle, from all sorts of angles around like the cognition in the gut, and I'm less interested personally in those approaches. And I think it's part of. I think what the most interesting thing that this question raises for me is also pushing our understanding of ayahuasca outside this very neuroscience-y, cognitivist, sort of visionary bias that is very predominant in psychedelics. And I think that psychedelic experiences in general are very embodied. They have a very strong embodied dimension. I think cognition is embodied. So it's not just, the question of psychedelics, but I think so it provides an interesting corrective to that lens. So that's where I would take that question personally, analytically.
Thank you. If I may ask another question. So as of my understanding, ayahuasca helps to open up the subconsciousness. So you have access to trauma, to thoughts, to experience you've experienced someone in your life, maybe back in your childhood. So it could be a tool to reconcile with your inner child, with basically trauma from back then. Can you say some words on this?
So that's the official discourse of MAPS and of the psychedelic science renaissance. That's their very peculiar, very particular and sort of parochial lens. That's how they're framing things. And it's an interesting lens on the story. I think that's part of what one could say about it. But again, even from urban Brazilian practices, that is quite meaningless. And certainly from indigenous perspectives, that's really not the kind of realm of understanding that they operate in. So, but it's one part of the story, perhaps.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we have Laura.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I was actually quite interested in getting back to the question about speaking plants or speaking with plants, or well, not about plants. and you had like the page with the 2 very best-selling books about like the secret world and scientific discoveries about the plants. And I just was asking, because you weren't very critical of those books, if you think that those books are helping to get a story out there for people who are not engaging with plants or different kind of ontologies with our environment to even think about all of this stuff and learn something about it? Or is it maybe some kind of appropriation of getting back to like these, using those indigenous stories, using all this knowledge and kind of bringing it back into a very Western narrative to get back into like, yeah, tell us a little bit more about drugs, or like getting back into this kind of narration? I think just, yeah, are they good, or are they okay, or are they, how do you stand for them? Because I did hear that some are better than others, but yeah, I would just be really interested to hear stance on those.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really important questions. I think I'm sort of ethnographically very fascinated by the fact that there is this sudden boom, and it's unexpected for a lot of the people who are writing these books. They're sort of like overwhelmed. These are everywhere in train stations in France. I don't know, I'm assuming in Germany as well.
Every train station.
In the UK.
I mean, yeah.
So that's a very interesting phenomenon in itself. Of course, there's sort of, you know, one has to take these not as sort of, I mean, I don't ever approach any scientific practice as sort of factual or real in any other way than any other form or set of practices are. But I think that there's a very interesting, I don't want to give up on the hope that there could be forms of engagement and encounter and mutual reconfiguration. And so I'm less familiar with the first book I had put up, but the second book, Gagliano's work, I'm very touched and moved by. I think she's doing something which can be perceived as a form of appropriation. In Thus Spoke the Plant, she's very explicit about the fact that she's dieting plants, that she's undergoing shamanic processes with plants, and that it's the plants that are actually telling her in these shamanic practices what experiments to do. And the experiments that she has performed and managed to publish in the highest impact scientific journals are revolutionizing our way of thinking. And so that's complex. I think, you know, it's never ever black or white. I think it's a very positive thing that, you know, scientific understandings of plants are transforming. I think that can only be a good thing. And as she very clearly states in the book, there are 2 revolutions happening at the moment in the world of plants. One is this sort of plant sentience revolution, and the other one is the GMO sort of feed the world, you know, hydroponics, plants in space, and that's another agenda. So I'm interested in, you know, thinking more positively perhaps than I might have been inclined to before about this work and how it's positioning itself, because she's explicitly political about what that is doing. Now, my concern is, what does sentience mean? Are we just, you know, are we just animating the natural world with our human sort of capacities? And if it's just humanizing, you know, the biosphere, that's a very boring project. I don't think that's where we need to go. But a lot of this work is at the cusp of trying to articulate something different, and I think that discussion there is we need to invest in that discussion and sort of bring different sort of perspectives to that and feed that.
Thank you. So there are 2 more questions in the last row over there. The first one is, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah, and then followed by Kaushik.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm also very touched of your presentation, and I was thinking a lot right now, also during the questions, about the way we we think about or how that a lot of people, or that we have in our Western society, always the view on things, how in which way we can use it, in which way it we can there's a resource, we find a resource in something, and not really it's not really like about an idea, but more about, okay, what does it really make, scientifically make with us, and where is it good for, or without really having clear ideological ideas, actually, but we're still asking the question, okay, where is it good for, is it good for us, but where for? And I got a little bit feared of when you make these presentations, that a lot of people still absorb this presentation like this way, and this way, even if you're talking actually a lot about this communication with plants, or like the way we could also understand it, or like the idea of it. And but did you thought about, because when you said it's like it's verbreitet, it's spread out more and more about this information about that, and it's getting a little bit of trend also maybe. And did you thought about how we could schützen, how we could protect this knowledge, or this understanding, or so that it's not again a way of colonization, that that we just take this information and
thank you. These are critical questions. I'm more looking at how people are positioning themselves in relation to that question than articulating myself a sort of policy or a kind of recommendation kind of role, although of course that's a little bit naive to put it in those terms, because one's intervention is always is an intervention. I think there are many questions that are raised by this, and one of the things we're thinking about different strategies as a team, because I'm working as a team. Looking at how other plant medicines have been, for example, coca became cocaine, or even the medicalization of cannabis, that is growing hydroponics under sort of lights on 6-week cycles is not the same thing as, wild grown and, different forms of cultivating varieties. So there's, it's not just plant, not plant. It's in what kind of human and environmental context are plants going to be able to thrive in what way? And that's what draws me to these questions of, how plants are encountering this regime of value and biocapital, and is that they pose serious challenge, I think, to that very model as they're being absorbed. So if what happens is that we're going to just purify ayahuasca and give people pills, and that is very dystopian. And so part of what I want to do with the project is really speak less about the ayahuasca itself. There's this kind of fetishization with the substance. What is it about the substance? Which molecule is active? What's acting? This is kind of this sort of
Yes, I also think the way just the way they build up a relation to this plant is like totally different the way we build right now also a relation up to this, and I think this is already critical actually, and also in a way of I'm asking, so you're coming more out of this context because you also lived in Brazil, I guess, but like I don't know, like the people you work with, do you also have a critical view on the way you were, or the people you work with, or this group is my English.
I mean, I think what your question is we're always held accountable. We're in deep conversation with the people with whom we're working, and they're asking us, "What are you doing? What are you saying?" And we're trying to construct our response to their question as sort of honestly and ethically as we possibly can, and trying to work out alongside and with them what part of the questions we're asking is, what is necessary in your view in this moment? You know, what do you need science to be saying? What other discourses beyond, you know, the DMT does this, do you want to have out there? And one of the things that I've heard again and again, and that I'm picking up on, and that I really want to sort of push forward, is this idea that there is, you know, the ritual communal setting in which this experience takes place is as important, if not more important, than the substance. And that's something that comes across in all the different field sites that we're looking at, and in a way sort of demonstrating the validity and the importance of that, which is basically, you know, the labor of care, which is basically a kind of slowing down, a kind of not knowing, a kind of paying attention, a kind of just holding space. That's the native idiom. That's what people talk about. And it is that, you know, ultimately in my interviews with people who have experienced deep, profound, transformative change through these rituals, it is that, not the ayahuasca itself, which they end up sort of emphasizing as having been the most transformative thing. So you can have ayahuasca and be, you know, there's a lot of sexual abuse happening in ayahuasca circles. In Peru, the thing has become, you know, there's a lot of tourism, there's a lot of people who are jumping on this bandwagon to make money. There's nothing inherently good about this, right? It's all about the kind of interpersonal dynamics and the sort of, you know, which includes not just humans, but sort of the land they can or cannot live on, the spaces they can create. So trying to use this also to think well beyond sort of the efficacy of one thing, but to look at, you know, what kind of a meshwork, a network of support does this operate within, and how is that systemic thing, you know, delivering or not something that we could call healing. So I think that's where we need to home in, and then it becomes much broader than this question of ayahuasca. It becomes a question of, you know, what is it to be, what is healing, what is, you know, what is wellness, what is living well with others, human and non-human, and those are the more important questions I think we need to be asking.
Thank you.
I might just intersect. Next on the list is Kaushik, and then there's another question after that. I unfortunately have to close this discussion for us to get a little lunch break. But first, Kaushik.
Thanks, Emilia. So as you know, I mean, I admire this project and your work enormously, and one of the things that I really admire about it is the way in which you place the colonial encounter at the center of your analysis, and the way in which there's this sort of awful Faustian bargain in the colonial encounter between extermination and appropriation as kind of the only choices that are given, right? And the way in which then you show all the incommensurabilities that are at play when appropriation happens within the space of the colonial encounter. And therefore the ways in which you're saying something about globalization through all of this, right? I'm wondering if I could push you to think, however, about another axis of globalization. So one of the things that my student Nida Paracha, whom you've met, is interested in is thinking about ayahuasca practices in Colombia alongside a Sufi archive that she has found in Pakistan of traditional healing practices, and seeing all sorts of kinships there between the kinds of healing that are being articulated. And these healing practices are deeply minority practices, the subject of extreme state persecution, but they're not indigenous, right? And so I'm wondering how one might think about the kinds of comparisons and commensurabilities and incommensurabilities if we were thinking about the possibilities of worlds being constituted not just between colonial centers and peripheries, but between multiple minority healing practices, only some of which, however, are indigenous, and how one might think the politics of both indigeneity and globalization through that.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important and challenging question. I think So for me, the first step in addressing that, in trying to address that, was to have these 3 sites, lab, forest, city, so that, and to state at the outset that all the practices we're looking at in these 3 different sites are all reinventions. They're not tradition. One is not tradition, the other is not modernity. So it's really about sort of displacing this sort of latent trope in anthropology and STS, that there is, this kind of, within the trope of globalization, the trope of modernization, right, where there's this center periphery and some are at different ends of this spectrum. So I wanted to sort of reshuffle that by saying that, actually the LSD experimentations are old. This is going back. This isn't new. This is what's happened. This was in the 50s. This was the main sort of research agenda in psychiatry, and then it went underground, and so now it's a reinvention, but it has, if anything, it has a longer history. And by really pushing, the colonial story in the indigenous context and showing that this was nearly, in many places it was, eradicated, pushed underground, and so what people are doing is reinventing. And Ibin's crucial dilemma is that he has in his hands this enormous responsibility of what in today's world do I do with this thing that I inherited, and he is so acutely aware of what that is. And of course, what's deeply ambivalent, what you referred to as this Faustian bargain, is that their ticket in, indigeneity's ticket into this discourse is as tradition. So the only way they can come into the discussion is by sort of occupying that sort of predetermined space for themselves, that, appropriating that appropriation, as it were. And that's profoundly ambivalent, because once they step into that place, there's only a certain amount of things that they can say. And the situation in Brazil is really interesting because the churches have nearly a century of existence, right? And they're situating themselves as traditional practice. They're actually referred to in the sort of legal language as, depositories of traditional practice of ayahuasca. So there's this really interesting way in which all of this is working. And I think it's really important to remember that it is about the practices and not about the identities. So to really sort of parse, and Nita's project is incredible in that respect. We had a wonderful conversation that there was the World Ayahuasca Conference at the beginning of June, and it was really interesting to be in dialogue with her there, because this globalized sort of representation of ayahuasca was so Western and Latin American. So the globe that was on stage at the World Ayahuasca Conference was Latin America, Europe, and North America. There was no Africa, there was no Asia, there was, it was a very sort of circumscribed kind of globality. So I really take your point that, and this is what I'm trying to do through sort of actually moving to an attention of what is it that people are actually doing, and where do we, I don't know if the term is build an ethic of that around it, but I think it's about, for me, it's very much about qualifying what it is that this container technology, that this, this collective intelligence that is built up over time. It's something that doesn't just sort of spread out of nowhere. And, transmission and sort of something that I would want to call an institution is important. I think accountability across different so in that way, indigenous institutions, especially as they've had to move underground from the state radar, have managed to find very resilient ways to do that and to transmit. So they're sort of more visible in that process. But there are all sorts of collectives. There are collectives in Europe who are just delivering ayahuasca and making money. But there are lots of collectives who are doing incredible work, bringing in, really very creatively with no sense of limit of what, they're downloading information, that's their language. They're being instructed to bring in, Hindu deities like Egyptian mythology, and and they're drinking ayahuasca and they're channeling spirits and they're dancing and they're bringing in, all sorts of things are happening, and it's a very creative, very dynamic space. And I really think that sort of, the trap of sort of moving to indigeneity is saying, no, that's not authentic, that's not okay, that's not, and yet we do need to find ways to sort of make evaluations. So I am, very much with you there, and not sure what will come out in terms of a response around that question. But it's an important one, and I think just reminding people again and again that it's all reinvention, and that it's all about looking forward, right, as opposed to sort of articulating this around the past and authenticity, which is very damaging.
Okay, then our last question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your talk. And I somehow I read this book by Silvia Federici lately about the witch killing in the medieval times. These 300 years where in Europe women were just killed, and obviously also because of their knowledge about healing practices and their spiritual ways, and the way that they actually really did not accept the capitalization of labor and of being their land taken away for commercial reasons and so on. And I was really trying to figure out now what you said in this other tradition, what does it mean? Because I found Federiци's book extremely interesting, because she's making like the link between colonization, because it happened in the same time, and the killing of the women in Europe, in Western Europe, and that she makes lots of links that I don't want to come up with now, but they are actually they're very strictly linked to each other, and all this I don't know, I find it quite interesting when this knowledge which also in the West exists, when it pops up here and then, when I sometimes meet people, and I think that who are actually really connected to their ground. Sometimes it's gardeners, sometimes it could be anybody, sometimes it's a beekeeper, and all of a sudden, bloop, 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 it's there, and I find it quite interesting to look at the structures that you are talking about, and trying to find links to where I live. Yeah.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. I think, your point for me raises the question of what is indigeneity, right? Who is indigenous where? And it's a really beautiful and very important question. And I think in braiding sweetgrass, her definition of being indigenous is being accountable to the land that you're on. So knowing the land that you're on, honoring the land that you're on, building good relationship with the land and the beings that you're on, and that can take many forms. One doesn't have to be. Indigenous. The history of humanity is migration. We're all migrants, and so the language of indigeneity is also one that sits very uncomfortably with questions around migration that are becoming very acute today. So we do need to be really careful about the kind of identity work that we can fall into when we pick up these labels. And so there's nothing essential about indigeneity. It's very much a continual becoming with place and with others. And so that very important sort of moment in our own history here is reminds us of that. And so, thank you for raising that point. And I think there's some really interesting work coming up at the moment around, this question of who is indigenous where.
All right, then thank you so much, Emilia, for your talk. Also, thank you all for the great discussion, and let's have lunch.